Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. We are continuing our series through the Bible. We're doing a crash course through every book of the 66 books in the canon. And Jeremy is back after a long break, and we're going to resume where we left off in Second Kings. But Jeremy, give us an update. Why weren't we able to continue this? I know like our 4 listeners were dying for where's Second Kings? Where is Second Kings?
I'm sure everybody is waiting with bated breath for the next installment of Second Kings. We moved to California, so we lived in Chicago. For those of you who don't know, I was recording in Chicago, and Haig was in New York, and I made the big move over to California, and I'm here in good old Fresno. So we had a lot of uprooting, had to settle in. We just finally kind of settled into my house, and I don't know if you can tell, but I've got paint all over my hands from painting in there. So it's been a journey, but I'm glad to be back on, starting back up these series again with you.
Awesome. It's good to have you back, my friend. And let's talk Second Kings. Let's jump right into it, because they were waiting a few months for your move to continue this. So last episode on the Crash Course series, we discussed the major themes. And real quick, but just to recap, I think it's important to remember that First and Second Kings are one book. It's not like they were divided into these 4 parts, but like all of First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings they're connected in this overarching narrative that is sweeping through a long history of the Israelites and Judea. So it's a lot of ground to cover because of how many centuries it covers.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, like anything you read in the Bible, it's connected to other parts of the Bible, and so First and Second Kings is part of even a longer trajectory that started in Samuel and Judges, and so it's continuing a narrative all the way through. But I mean, just to recap, I guess First Kings ended David's story, King David, and introduced Solomon and his story. Solomon seemed like he was going to do really good, and then ended up kind of failing and swinging out at the end of the story. You're kind of left with a tragedy of Solomon, and then his family after him ends up in a civil war, and the 2 territories, Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom, they break off, and they have 2 different capital cities from then on. And there's just divides and power plays all throughout First Kings until we get here to Second Kings. It's kind of hard too, because it's not like First Kings closes in a really clean way and opens up Second Kings. It just kind of there's no real clear structural distinction between First Kings and Second Kings. It's just like they ran out of paper on the scroll and they continued it in the next one.
Part 2. I think we're always used to having like these nicely fit trilogies with all the media we consume. But I think that's an important point. I think it's also fascinating how, like, historically, there's always these North and South civil wars. There's never like an East and a West civil war. It's like North Korea, South Korea, the North and the South in the American Civil War. Like it's always North and South. I don't know. I think that someone needs to do a study on what's up with the horizontal line. Anyway.
And it's I mean, it's always I think I don't want to get too off topic, but it's always interesting that, like, if you remember the beginning of the story in Genesis, like all these families are related. So this is just like really bad family dynamics playing out. Like a long heritage of old histories, and they're all sort of related, but they hate each other and they're killing each other over power. Also, there's a way to get into this story that with our contemporary storytelling, it looks a lot like Game of Thrones, man. I mean, like when you read these stories, there's a lot of political maneuvering. There's like murders and executions and like tragedies, and it really is just like it's funny to think that like a good chunk of our Old Testament is like akin to a long sustained like storytelling around Game of Thrones.
And the thing about like Game of Thrones is like J.R. Martin is just pretty much like reciting European history. It's like an anti-fantasy that's trying to like reclaim historical stories of this is how gruesome kingdoms and political powers work when there's inheritance connected to all this for claim. And like what's anchoring the whole First Samuel is like God warns the people, if you go this route of having a king where I am no longer the king, you're going to have oppression, you're going to have injustice in the land. Like there's the warning, but God concedes and like, all right, you want a king to be like everyone else? Sure. I'm maker of heaven and earth, but whatever, you guys, here's your king. And like, there's this kingdom that splits like 3 generations in. Like it's not even like they didn't even go for a good run. Like America went for like 15 presidents or 14 presidents before Lincoln came in and was like, all right, we're not going to split, guys. They went 3 kings in, and you have this theme of about 20 northern kings being evaluated, whether they were following God or not. And like all the northern kings were horrible. And then you have the southern kingdoms, another 20 kind of being judged through this lens and evaluated. And maybe two on a generous side, like there's definitely 2 great kings, Josiah and Hezekiah. There's probably a few others in that category that were good, okay. But there's like only 2 extremely solid kings out of like 40 evaluations.
Right. And even those good kings are good basically because they don't follow other idols and they protect Jerusalem. Which isn't, I mean, I guess, it's based on Deuteronomy. It's based on, the commandments from Exodus. But it's a very strange success for those 2 kings that are successful.
But they get people back to worshiping God. And it's like, it's funny, like we evaluate history too this way, right? I just mentioned Abraham Lincoln. Like we judge American history through the lens of the presidents. Local churches judge the lens of the health of the church through pastors. It's a weird phenomenon where you have like leaders or companies, like the CEO determines the season, like Steve Jobs' era of Apple. Now it's Tim Cook's, like it's a way that we also tell history too, based on the leadership. And do you have a favorite president? Like
I mean, I'm so bad at the U.S. history. I haven't like taken a course on that in so long. But I remember really thinking Teddy Roosevelt was a pretty nutso guy, but like also pretty awesome. I think I remember an anecdote from like high school that he got shot during a message, and he finished the message before getting it looked at and addressed.
Yeah, Rough Rider Roosevelt.
Yeah, Rough Rider Roosevelt. So, and that's like again, to your point, like that defines an era of like a certain type of American culture and a certain type of American history. What about you? Before I can't let you go ask the question without.
Yeah, of course. No, I already mentioned who's my favorite. Lincoln's definitely the number 1 person for me, because not only ending slavery, but was given this difficult task of keeping the North and South together and somehow succeeded. And the cool thing about him is after the North won eventually, after having really awful generals, then finding the victory, he was pretty compassionate in the reforms, which was cool, because I think usually when you defeat your enemy, you want to like tax them or let them suffer. And we kind of did that to Germany after World War I, and that kind of just created a breathing ground for World War II. So there's something about like the compassion and the circumstance. I think another thing about leadership is like circumstances really make like Lincoln's available, because it's like sometimes the like Teddy Roosevelt, for example, was dying to have a war so he could be like remembered. So he like does this whole like created this war, which is absurd, but like because he knows like there's history defining here. And it's good to be defined as someone who kind of unites and to kind of like preserve an awful situation, but preserves the unity. And like the kings and what we're reading about, Josiah, and like by the time you get to the good kings in the southern kingdom of Judea, you already have the northern kingdom sacked by the Assyrians.
Right.
And then later the Babylonians come and sack Judea and destroy the temple for the first time, which is important. These are important themes, because you transition from the sacking of kings to exile. Right. They no longer have the land, and like this theme is super relevant for us as Armenians, because like for most of our history we don't have land to call our own, or our city's been sacked, and then there's these seasons of being a diaspora community, being in exile. Right. I mean, I resonate with that sort of feeling of like, oh man, we're crushed, but now we're in exile, but somehow we're still together, and we're still like, God has a plan through all this.
Right. It's a way that the story is told in Second Kings. Well, really through the whole, from First Kings to Second Kings, but the way the story is told, it begins with promise and ends in exile. And I think for both, for North and South, it's like, you go one direction, they tell the history of the North, it ends in exile. They reverse, go back to the Southern Kingdom, tell the story of the Southern Kingdom, it ends in exile. And so I think there's an important message there that like that's what human power untethered from God's grace does. It leads us into pain and exile, because we're going to run ourselves into the ground.
Yep.
And I think also the way that the prophets are cast, because we haven't talked about Elijah and Elisha yet, but the way the prophets are cast are as kind of a counter narrative to that story of power plays and legitimating one's monarchy or hierarchy or whatever. And here's Elijah and Elisha out in the middle of nowhere, running around without a place to call their own, and they're calling this powerful system into question.
Yeah, and the Second Kings kind of just continues that narrative of the Elijah, and then it begins with the chariots of fire, him taking up, and then Elisha wanting double the authority of Elijah, and you see that succession happen, and it's like actually the only like positive succession if you think about it.
Oh, sure, that's interesting. Yeah.
Where Elijah gets a double portion. He performs like 14 miracles. Elijah about 7, and all of this. And it's interesting because the mantle has been passed, literally, figuratively, to that next generation. And then when we continue the rest of the Old Testament, you're going to see this prophetic theme take over now. Yeah. The prophets now are speaking in exile. They were speaking during the events leading to exile. And then in the midst of all that they're promising God's faithfulness and how he's going to stay true to his covenants, even though it doesn't seem like it's impossible right now. Like you're completely destroyed, annihilated, the temple's destroyed, the line of the Israelite kingdoms come to an end. It's ambiguous. It ends on a weird. How does Second Kings end? Because I think this is a cool little theme.
Yeah, no, there's a short little story about like a king. He's not the king anymore, but like one of the grandkids of the last king that was in Judah, and he's in not Assyria, Babylon at this point. He's in exile, and he gets invited to have a meal with the king of Babylon, and that's like a little snippet, a little like foretaste of the hope that still exists for Israel. It's I think we were talking earlier, it's like when you watch a Marvel movie and it ends a certain way, and then you get like a little teaser in the post-credit scene, like, oh, they're gonna make this movie now. It's kind of like that, where at the end of this you get a little snippet of the guy who should be king in Judah having a meal with the king of Babylon, as if it's like, okay, here's a taste of things to come. But I mean, the book doesn't end very positively, except for that note, and that note is very cryptic. Like it's not like, how is this going to happen? Like, what's this going to look like? So, but back to the prophets, I do think the prophets are crucial for understanding what's going on in Kings, because I had never noticed that. That's an interesting point. That's the only healthy transition of power in First and Second Kings between Elijah and Elisha, and it's successful because that next generation is given sort of the blessing by the other generation, but it's also successful because it's even more productive. It's even more useful. I mean, I'm trying to recall, and maybe I'm wrong, you can call me out on it, but I don't think there's any following generation or any succession that's more successful than the next. Like, one does good and then the next one kind of screws it up. I don't know that there's ever one that does good and the next one does better. So it's very interesting to pick up on that. I also do want to note, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but the center of power is the capital cities in both northern and southern kingdoms, but really Jerusalem becomes the big center of, this is where everything is kind of honed in, and that's where like power is supposed to be maintained and secured and guarded. And it's interesting that most of what God does for the people happens outside of Jerusalem with the prophets. They're running around on the margins. So I don't know like what that says, but I think there's something about the system that was created in Jerusalem that was sort of broken, and there's like this need to protect it, and yet God is outside of Jerusalem with the prophets doing his work without even recognizing that, without people even recognizing that that's happening. I think that's important to remember.
And
I think it'll preach, right? Like, you can preach that. It's hard to find stuff you can preach out of First and Second Kings, but you might be able to do that.
No, I mean, it's absolutely true. I mean, idolatry destroys spirituality. Like, if we're worshiping false gods, idols, and we're putting them in the center of the place where God is, of course God's not going to be sticking around. And the same thing holds true today. I mean, if you're pursuing the love of money, the love of power, sex, fame, whatever it is, you already block out God. You're pursuing something else.
Right.
And
it's one of the reasons that originally God said he didn't want David to build a temple. He's like, you're going to build me a house? Like, I was happy in a tent where I could go from place to place. I'm going to go wherever I want. Like, you don't house me in, I house you in. It was kind of a flex. God is like, get out of here. I'm going to do this instead. And so, in some ways, I think Second Kings has little reminders that, okay, there's the reminder of God's presence in the temple in Jerusalem. It's good, but he's not boxed in. He's out there beyond this space.
Yep.
I think that's important for us to remember in the 21st century as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, man. Any like favorite parts of the Second Kings or least favorite parts?
I mean, there's some weird stuff in Second Kings that's hard to swallow. Just culturally, it's so different than us. I mean, we're talking about an ancient text with, assumptions that people would understand what's being read in it. And, we're thousands of years removed from it. So there's stuff that doesn't make sense to me. There's a scene, I can't remember if it's Elijah or Elisha. I think it's Elijah.
Oh, it's Elisha. But the she bears?
It's Elisha with the bears.
Yeah, he's the bold one. Because
he gets mocked and teased by a bunch of, it says, I don't know, it's a weird Hebrew word too. It's not clear whether it's, kids or whether it's adults, but it's just weird where he gets mocked and teased, and then he calls down bears to attack these kids and maul these kids.
Yeah, so
it's a very strange text.
Hey man, I think I hear that as a very common critique, like a skeptic would use. My atheist friends would be like, Elisha called the bears to demolish these youths. Like, what kind of God is this? And I mean, I've heard very fascinating apologetics to it. Sometimes it's better not to like defend it or to allow it, but also like for me, it's important to know that whenever you hear someone in the Bible do something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's God ordained just because it happens.
That's right.
Like if you read all the characters in the Bible, there's faults to them, except for Christ. Everyone has a fault. So I don't know if this is a showing of Elisha losing his temper, or it's just like, you don't mess with the prophets. Like, don't mess with them. Be careful who you mess with.
Who knows? I mean, it's one of those things where that's another thing too, is we think like, oh, if we apply enough of our, modern historical critical tools to, the text, we can understand everything written in it and comprehend it. And there's this book is complex. It's old, and there's things that we won't comprehend and understand about it. There's some stuff in it that's just inaccessible to us. That doesn't mean we don't try, but it also just, there's who knows what the story means, and there's the thing with the axe too, where they throw the axe in the river, and I think that's in
it's also
later on
right after this. Yeah. So
yeah.
But it's also cool too, because it's like this is a section where you have a lot of miracles, and it gets the stage ready for Jesus's ministry, which I get excited about. And Jesus having like, except for the mauling of the youths, some similar miracles, reproducing the oil, like food.
Right.
He walks on water, doesn't make an axe head float. There is these signs and wonders that are not just healing miracles, but these supernatural signs, pointing to the power of God. And I think I think it's cool. I mean, and I think it's also important too, because sometimes we kind of be like, Jesus is the Son of God because he performed miracles. I mean, is Elijah or Elisha the Son of God because they performed miracles? No, like Jesus is the Son of God because he died for the forgiveness of sins, lived a sinless life, and is alive and well. He resurrected and like ushered in a new creation. Like, and he's the long-awaited king, actually. Like as the Christian church interprets the lineage being fulfilled and found, Jesus being the prophet and the king and the priest, and fulfills the Old Testament promises. Like that's
right.
This is all pointing to the coming of the king.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at there is that to read First and Second Kings is not just to read an ancient history, but it's to understand better as a church the context in which Christ is king.
Yeah.
And then also, I mean, he's there's that classic threefold office of Christ, of the prophet, the priest, and the king. And what Jesus does in his Galilean ministry, and even up into Jerusalem, is almost, I mean, the way the gospel narratives work, I mean, they almost mimic. There's stories that are taken right out of Elijah's ministry. There's things that he does that look like, Old Testament prophets. So he is living into that tradition. And so, yeah, he does miracles. The prophets did miracles too, right? And that's like what you're saying exactly. He's living into that story, and the miracles are done not to be kind of cool magic tricks, but to be stamps of authority, and also like reflective of or indicative of who God is. When God brings somebody back to life in these stories, or brings somebody back to health, it's to indicate that God is a God who desires health and thriving for human beings, right? And I mean, so I guess all I'm saying is to point it back to, or to point it forward to Jesus, is important for the church to do as it reads these texts. And I think, except for John, every gospel begins with John the Baptist, and John the Baptist is likened to the prophets. I mean, he's a callback to the prophets, and he's even called the Elisha at one point, right? So
depending on which gospel, he's mentioned in the Gospel of John. John was not the light, but he testified to the light.
Right, it's not as clearly,
but it's like John the Baptist, and is like clearly linked to Elijah, and like you mentioned, like people, like when Peter asked Peter, who do you say I am? The rumor is he's the second coming of Elijah.
Right.
And then there's that whole debate. And I mean, I would say John the Baptist is Elijah. And that's like, whoa, what does that mean? Because Elijah he doesn't die naturally. Like him and Enoch, they get taken up into heaven. It's you to explain that like logically is you have to be humble about what that means. Like I don't know,
Right.
but I'm
Right.
just being submitted to like what it means. Elijah didn't
Right.
die naturally.
Yeah. I think, and that's just part of, I think if we get anything out of this series, that's one thing to get, that when we approach these texts, we should do that humbly. You know, we're not going to understand everything completely in these texts. And to come to anything for complete understanding like that would be to try to domesticate it. We need to hear it. We need to listen to it, see what it is that these texts are trying to get across to us, and have a conversation around it, rather than just be like, yep, this is exactly what this means.
I remember the History Channel's turned into like just entertainment, but I remember watching an Ancient Aliens episode on the chariots of fire, and how like the chariots were like a flying saucer, and how Elijah was actually taken up by aliens and not by God.
There you go. You heard it here first, folks.
Ancient aliens. But yeah, I mean, humility is key, especially on those texts where it's just like completely other. But yeah, I mean, I have a giant painting in my office with the Elijah being taken up in the chariots, and the prophetic mantles being passed down to Elisha. It's pretty cool.
Nice.
That passing of the torch, and I think that's the beautiful thing. I think, I mean, as we're talking, that I'm coming to that conclusion of that passing of the torch of being faithful to the covenant of God, even if the powers that be may not be. You know, it just God is faithful. He's going to fulfill this, even though it may not look like it. But one day he has in Christ. But yeah, I mean, the scene is set here about these offices being established firmly: the prophet, the priests, and the kings.
Right. Yeah, and I think, I guess to sort of set the scene for coming books, if you like the prophets, you're going to get much more of them. And again, most of the time, the prophets are outsiders who are coming in to speak some sort of truth to the powerful situations that are going on, and to the centers and of society. And so very few of the prophets, I think, inhabit Jerusalem. I think Isaiah, Jeremiah, some of the major ones do. But most of the, like Amos, Habakkuk, like these are, I mean, a lot of them are going to the north too. They're not even in the south.
Or are they going to Assyria, like Jonah? He's like, you're not even going to, you're going to the people who just destroyed your whole upbringing.
Right. And there's a lot of interesting things when we get to the prophets. We'll I guess we'll tease it here now, but there's a lot of times where the northern prophets are kept and cultivated by the southern prophets. Like I've read, I mean, it's not clear, but I've read arguments that Jonah was written, Jonah was occurring in the northern kingdom, but it was kept and maintained as a text to read in the south, as a reminder of what happened to the north. Like, hey, don't do Jonah, because look how it ended for the northern kingdom. So it's very interesting how these texts meant so much to these different communities, and how we can use them today to remember who we're called to be, and to be called onto the, out on some of the things that we're participating in.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And we will be picking up the theme of the prophets for the next chunk of scripture. I mean, there's going to be some wisdom literature in between, and another history lesson with Chronicles, but the prophets are going to take over the Old Testament as we continue this narrative. And I know I was also thinking about, like, I recently watched Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King, and like how Aragorn is like this like lost descendant of the kings of man. Like, like he's like hidden in obscurity, in exile, literally. And then like he arrives on the scene. No, the line is continued, and the king has returned. And you get the ultimate return of the king, like in the Bible with Palm Sunday. It's like the king is coming.
The king is coming. I like that. And then on a nerdy note, like the Hebrew arrangement of the Bible is different than the Christian arrangement of the Bible. And so the Hebrew arrangement is the Tanakh, if you ever hear someone talking about the Tanakh. And it literally means, it's just an abbreviated version of the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. the law, the prophets, and the writings. And so, I mean, that in and of itself, the prophetic literature, it's a huge chunk. It's central to the whole like Old Testament text. And I think coming up soon, we're going to be reading a lot of that, into what we're trying to experience today in the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Jeremy, congratulations on your new home and your new move, and I look forward to discussing more Bible with you. Thank you for those listening. Remember to stay caffeinated. God bless you. And don't just take our word for it. Read the good word yourself, pick up the Bible and read it. And blessings to you all. All right, take care.
Yep.